Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dorklords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today, it's time for Mini Topics 2.0. I put out a call for topics that wouldn't call for an entire video, and I got some awesome responses that I'm happy to share with you now. In fact, I received so many quality questions that I've split up the answers into 2 videos. This is part 1. Look for part 2 in the near future. I'm going to start with a question I received from a few folks wanting me to give my theories on a recently released production photo from the Rings of Power. In it, we see the Sylvan elf character, Arondir, standing atop an apparently elven tower, and I'm guessing he's gazing east at the rising sun. The terrain is a flat plain surrounded by mountains. There's a river flowing east to west, and a series of roads, possibly farmland, not much in the way of dwellings. Arondir and Bronwyn, the human woman that he has a relationship with, supposedly live in the region known as Tir Harad. Harad means south, Tir means watch, so I'm thinking this tower might be the watchtower associated with Tir Harad. There are also multiple photos of Arondir in combat, likely with orcs, one would think. So Arondir is possibly using the tower to look east for orcs. Notice there's a line of mountains running along the right side of the photo. That would be to the south side of the plain. The southernmost mountain range on Tolkien's maps that runs east-west is the line of mountains running along Mordor's southern border. Right at the southwest corner of Mordor lie the crossings of Poros. The Poros is a river that runs east-west, and the crossings lie on the border between Mordor and southern Gondor. I think this is where the tower is located. All right, on to the next question. It's from Pomp Pivapony. I'm terribly sorry. I'm sure I've mispronounced that, but let's get into it. Pomp asks, why is the Hobbit's lifespan prolonged compared to the average lifespan of men, even though Hobbits are said to be branched from that race? Is it possible that the old Took possessed one of the lesser rings that would have prolonged his lifespan? After all, only Bilbo and Gollum were able to live a longer life. I think Tolkien never gave a clear answer to those questions. It'd be nice to hear your thoughts. All right, thanks so much for the question, Pomp. Just to clue everyone in, Pomp references the old Took, Gerontius Took. Gerontius had the title of oldest ever Hobbit at 130 years of age until Bilbo reached 131 years, right before sailing to the west. Obviously, Bilbo's age was ring-aided, so Pomp is wondering how the old Took lived as long as he did. For starters, as you indicated, Pomp, Hobbits tend to live longer than the other men of Middle-earth. We get this quote from the Fellowship of the Ring regarding Bilbo. 60 years had passed since he set out on his memorable journey, and he was old even for hobbits, who reached 100 as often as not. So, hobbits on average live to 100 years old. Why? I don't think we're given a concrete reason. They're certainly very hardy, and perhaps their location, the Shire, adds to their health, which increases their lifespan. As for the old Took, we have a real-world reason why he lived so long. It turns out both of Tolkien's grandfathers lived to ripe old ages. This is from one of his letters. The old Took has part of his origin in the fact that both my grandfathers were long-lived. My father's father was in his 11th year when Waterloo was fought. My mother's father, a much younger man, was born before Queen Victoria came to the throne and survived till his 99th year, missing his 100, with which he was as much concerned as Bilbo was to surpass the old Took, only because he mowed a large lawn that spring and then sat in the wind without a jacket. My condolences to Tolkien's grandfather. But he was the inspiration for the old Took. Took, Tolkien? Maybe a connection there as well? Now, Pomp theorizes that perhaps Gerontius was aided by a magic ring as well. I like that notion. And according to the Hobbit, he did receive a magic item from Gandalf. He apparently had a pair of diamond magic cufflinks that fastened themselves and never came undone. Could he have had an item that prolonged his life? Perhaps. Although I think the most likely answer is that he had good genes. In another of Tolkien's letters, he writes about Lalia the Great, another long-lived hobbit. A well-known case was that of Lalia the Great, or less courteously, the Fat. Fortinbras II, one-time head of the Tooks, married Lalia of the Clayhangers. He died in 1380 at the age of 102, but she long outlived him, coming to an unfortunate end in 1402 at the age of 119. In her last and fattest years, she had the custom of being wheeled to the great door to take the air on a fine morning. In the spring of 1402, her clumsy attendant let the heavy chair run over the threshold and tipped Lalia down the flight of steps into the garden. So ended a reign and life that might well have rivaled that of the great Took. So I think the old Took was just a lucky hobbit with magic cufflinks. So, thanks again, Pomp. I hope that answers your question. Our second question comes from longtime friend of the channel, Thomas Ryan. Thomas was pretty funny. As a prank, he posted a series of open-ended questions, all of which ended with discuss, which was pretty great for a mini-topic video. One of his questions involved a fun theory about Pippin. Peregrine Took is the most powerful entity on Middle-earth. Slew Gandalf the Grey and the last remaining Balrog of Morgoth via manipulation, flummoxed Sauron, and cleared the way for Aragorn to ascend the throne by suborning the loyalty of a member of the Tower of the Guard. Discuss. I love it. Pippin's apparent bumbling, fool of a Took, another Took, was merely a clever ruse by a master manipulator. The undisputed hero of Middle-earth. Well played, Peregrine Took. Oh, and actually, on that note, hang on. Welcome the newest member of the Dorklords family, Pippin, a.k.a. Mr. Pickles. I am bribing him with treats. Much like Pippin, he enjoys second breakfast. Let's say hello to the camera. Oh, say hello to the camera, Mr. Pickles. It's Mr. Pickles, everybody. A hero of Middle-earth. All right, he's going after the treats. Anyway, all right, back to the topics. Pippin is now sleeping next to the camera. Thank you, Pippin. Okay, Thomas did ask one question that didn't end with discuss. So let's tackle that question. Thomas asks, were the 9 ring-bearers of men present on the Dagorlad and in the siege of Barad-dûr? My research actually changed my mind on this topic. My first impulse was to say, hey, if they'd been involved in the Battle of Dagorlad at the end of the Second Age, surely they would have appeared in the story. And they didn't show up in the description of the battle or the subsequent siege of Barad-dûr. Here's what we know. We get 2 important notes about the Second Age in the appendices. First, we get 2251. The quote reads, about this time the Nazgul, or ring-wraiths, slaves of the 9 rings, first appear. So, they're on the scene roughly 1,000 years before the Battle of Dagorlad. The second date is 3441. Sauron overthrown by Elendil and Gil-galad, who perish. Isildur takes the One Ring. Sauron passes away, and the ring-wraiths go into the shadows. The Second Age ends. So the 9 are active until Isildur takes the ring. They then disappear until well into the Third Age, when Sauron begins to reemerge. If they were active agents of Sauron, in fact, his most powerful lieutenants, it seems unlikely that they wouldn't have shown up during the 7-year siege of Barad-dûr. Surely no other battlefronts in Middle-earth would have been as important. In the Silmarillion, we're told, then Gil-galad and Elendil passed into Mordor and encompassed the stronghold of Sauron, and they laid siege to it for 7 years, and suffered grievous loss by fire and by the darts and bolts of the enemy. and Sauron sent many sorties against them. I'm now inclined to believe that the Nazgul were leading some of those sorties. And here's the best evidence I found for the Nazgul's involvement. In the Unfinished Tales, Tolkien writes about a saddened Thranduil, whose father, the king, was killed in the fighting, leading the survivors of his army back to the woodland realm after the War of the Last Alliance has ended. There are orcs hiding in the forest near the Gladden Fields. They let Thranduil pass because his army is a bit too big, but these orcs will later be the ones who kill Isildur after he loses the ring in the river. Thranduil they let pass, for even his diminished army was far too strong for them. But they bided their time, for the most part hidden in the forest, while others lurked along the riverbanks. It is unlikely that any news of Sauron's fall had reached them, for he had been besieged in Mordor, and all his forces had been destroyed. If any few had escaped, they had fled far to the east with the Ringwraiths. This small detachment in the north of no account was forgotten. Probably they thought that Sauron had been victorious, and the war-scarred army of Thranduil was retreating to hide in fastnesses of the forest. So there we get a very important quote. If any few had escaped, they had fled far to the east with the Ringwraiths. That suggests that there were orcs that escaped the siege, and they fled with the Ringwraiths. Not to the Ringwraiths, but with the Ringwraiths, suggesting the Ringwraiths were also present at the siege. Thomas, thank you so much for your awesome questions, and I hope I answered this one. You can check out Thomas's discuss questions on the post in which I called for mini topics. I may have to turn some of those into full-length videos. Our next question comes from Ninja Zen, who writes, during the Council of Elrond, Gandalf mentions that the entrance to Isengard had guards. Are these men or orcs in disguise? And if they're men, are they evil or oblivious to Saruman's turn to evil? Awesome question. So first, we need to know, are Saruman's guards men? And if so, why are they following him? The Gandalf quote that Ninja Zen references is as follows. Late one evening, I came to the gate, like a great arch in the wall of rock, and it was strongly guarded. But the keepers of the gate were on the watch for me and told me that Saruman awaited me. I rode under the arch, and the gate closed silently behind me. And suddenly I was afraid, though I knew no reason for it. But I rode to the foot of Orthanc and came to the stair of Saruman, and there he met me and led me up to his high chamber. So you have come, Gandalf, he said to me gravely. But in his eyes there seemed to be a white light, as if a cold laughter was in his heart. I think this quote strongly implies that the guards were men. Because if they'd been orcs, Gandalf would have turned around and ridden away as fast as he could. So he felt afraid, but he didn't know the reason. I think orc guards would have given him that reason. We also get this bit of information from Unfinished Tales about Saruman's spies. Saruman had long taken an interest in the Shire, because Gandalf did, and he was suspicious of him. And he begun to feel certain that in some way the Shire was connected with the ring in Gandalf's mind. He therefore began to collect detailed information about the Shire. For this, he used hobbits within the Shire in the pay of the Bracegirdles and the Sackville Bagginses. But his agents were men of Dunlandish origin. The Dunlandings are major supporters of Saruman, but I don't think their whole culture is evil. They are generational enemies with their neighbors, the Rohirrim, and Saruman has promised them a way to defeat their enemies. This quote from Unfinished Tales dates back 500 years or so before the War of the Ring. But under Brago and Aldor, the Dunlandings were rooted out again and driven away beyond the Isen, and the fords of Isen were guarded. Thus the Rohirrim earned the hatred of the Dunlandings, which was not appeased until the return of the king, then far off in the future. Whenever the Rohirrim were weak or in trouble, the Dunlandings renewed their attacks. So, they're enemies almost from the get-go. Later, during the Long Winter, Wulf leads an army of Dunlendings to lay siege on Helm Hammerhand and the Rohirrim. During that siege, Helm becomes a feared mythical figure to the Dunlendings. From the appendices. Helm grew fierce and gaunt for famine and grief, and the dread of him alone was worth many men in the defense of the burg. He would go out by himself, clad in white, and stalk like a snow troll into the camps of his enemies, and slay many men with his hands. It was believed that if he bore no weapon would bite on him. The Dunlending said that if he could find no food, he ate men. That tale lasted long in Dunland. So the Dunlendings have built up this inhuman enemy that has taken their land and eaten their people. Saruman exploits that fear and hatred, turning villagers into soldiers. So I hope that answers your question, Ninja Zen. Thank you so much. The next question comes from Super Dixie Chicken. Love that name, by the way. Grima Wormtongue aids Saruman in corrupting Rohan. And at one point, I think he's referred to as a man of Rohan. What was his backstory? Did Tolkien ever say how Saruman recruited him to spy for him? I placed this question here because it's related to the topic about Saruman's guards. As Super Dixie Chicken suggests, Grima was a man of Rohan. We get this Gandalf quote from The Two Towers, a version of which was also used in the film. The wise speak only of what they know, Grima, son of Galmod. A witless worm have you become. Therefore be silent. Keep your forked tongue behind your teeth. I have not passed through fire and death to bandy crooked words with a serving man till the lightning falls. So in the middle of this awesome, insulting rant, Gandalf calls Grima son of Galmod. We don't know much about Galmod, but it shows that Grima has a traceable lineage. He didn't just show up out of nowhere. We also learn that Grima wasn't always a spy. He was an actual trusted advisor for a time. We get this quote from Gandalf. Once it was a man, and did you service in its fashion. He calls Grima it. Ouch. Anyway, he goes on to say, how far back his treachery goes, who can guess, said Gandalf. He was not always evil. Once I do not doubt that he was the friend of Rohan, and even when his heart grew colder, he found you useful still. But for long now he has plotted your ruin, wearing the mask of friendship until he was ready. In those years Wormtongue's task was easy, and all that you did was swiftly known in Isengard, for your land was open, and strangers came and went. So I think that in order to be the king's advisor, Grima had to come from a notable family of Rohan. And at some point during his tenure, Saruman, more likely one of Saruman's agents, approached Grima with an offer. We get another quote that is used in the film, though Éomer says the line in the film while Gandalf delivers this line in the book. How long is it since Saruman bought you? What was the promised price? When all the men were dead, you were to pick your share of the treasure and take the woman you desire? Too long have you watched her under your eyelids and haunted her steps. Coming from Gandalf, that guess is probably correct. Grima wanted Éowyn after Rohan had fallen, and Saruman agreed. I mentioned the Dunlendings in the previous topic discussion. There were certainly families in Rohan that had some bit of Dunlending ancestry. Maybe that was the case with the House of Galmod. If so, since Saruman had the favor of the Dunlendings, maybe he used that ancient hatred to lure Grima into betraying the king of Rohan. That's just speculation. There's no proof of that. But I hope that answers your question, Super Dixie Chicken. Next up, a question from longtime Dorklords commenter, Julian Koning. Julian asks, did anyone ever meet Maglor again? That's a great question, and one that I've pondered myself, Julian. The short answer is we don't know. But I do have a longer theory crafting style answer for you. First, to catch everybody up on Maglor, he's the second oldest son of Feanor, and after the War of Wrath that ends the First Age, he and his brother, Mithras, steal 2 of the Silmarils, as per their oath. Maedhros ends up leaping into a volcano with his Silmaril. And here's what the Silmarillion says about Maglor. And it is told of Maglor that he could not endure the pain with which the Silmaril tormented him, and he cast it at last into the sea. And thereafter he wandered ever upon the shores, singing in pain and regret beside the waves. For Maglor was mighty among the singers of old, named only after Dairon of Doriath, but he came never back among the people of the elves. So that quote suggests that Maglor was never seen again. Certainly not publicly. I've mentioned this previously, but I'll mention it here as well since it's relevant. If I was looking for Maglor in the Second or Third Age, I would look for him on a little island off the western coast near the Grey Havens. That island was the site of Himring, the fortress of Maglor's brother Maedhros in the First Age. Because of its elevated location, it was one of the few sites that survived the cataclysm after the War of Wrath. We get this quote from the Silmarillion about Maglor's actions after the Battle of Sudden Flame, which obviously occurred prior to the War of Wrath. For Glaurung came thither, and passed through Maglor's Gap, and destroyed all the land between the arms of Gelion. Thence the orcs passed over Gelion with fire and terror, and came far into East Beleriand. Maglor joined Maedhros upon Himring. So Maglor stayed at Himring with his brother, and after throwing his Silmaril into the sea, I imagine he might have wandered down the coast to find something familiar, like the abandoned fortress he used to live in. But going back to Julian's question, I think there's only one legit candidate who could have secretly met with Maglor and kept his secret. And that individual has a very complicated past with Maglor, dating back to the third kinslaying in the First Age, when the sons of Feanor attacked their fellow elves for the sake of a Silmaril. Great was the sorrow of Eärendil and Elwing for the ruin of the havens of Sirion, and the captivity of their sons, and they feared that they would be slain, but it was not so. For Maglor took pity upon Elros and Elrond, and he cherished them, and love grew after between them, as little might be thought. But Maglor's heart was sick and weary with the burden of the dreadful oath. So for some period of time, after ransacking young Elrond's home, killing his friends and chasing away his mother, Maglor raised Elrond and his brother. We don't know how long he raised them, but the quote says love grew after between them. So Elrond knew and apparently shared a bond with Maglor. If I was writing the fanfic, I'd say that Maglor went to Elrond in secret, asking for his help to remain hidden, and Elrond obliged, setting him up in some remote location. Remember, Maglor could not go west. He did not have the Valar's forgiveness. So he would have had to stay in Middle-earth, struggling with his guilt, and perhaps, occasionally, getting a visit from Elrond. I hope that answers your question, Julian. And the next question is from Nathan Winning. Nathan writes, maybe this is a full video length topic. You're probably right there, Nathan. But I figure I'll ask just the same. We're going to do this. I'm really confused about the half-elves and being able to choose between mortal and immortal. Elros and Elrond, then later Arwen, are the only ones I can think of who made the choice. Were all half-elves given the choice? Thanks for the question, Nathan. There's a bit of ambiguity in the answer, but let's start with what we know. Elrond's father, Eärendil, was a half-elf, son of the human Tuor, who we're going to talk about in the next topic, and the elf Idril. The only other elven-human marriage of the First Age was Beren and Luthien. Their granddaughter was Elwing. She married Eärendil, which brought the two lineages of half-elves together in one family. Elwing's father, Dior, Beren and Luthien's only son, is the ambiguous part that I mentioned, but put a pin in that. We'll come back to Dior. So near the end of the First Age, Eärendil and Elwing sail west to Aman to plead with the Valar to save Middle-earth from Morgoth, even though, for them, sailing west almost certainly means death. Against all odds, and with the help of a Silmaril, they are successful. And the Valar do send an army to deal with Morgoth. Then it's time for the Valar to judge our married couple's actions. But when all was spoken, Manwë gave judgment, and he said, "In this matter the power of doom is given to me. The peril that he, Eärendil, ventured for love of the two kindreds shall not fall upon Eärendil, nor shall it fall upon Elwing his wife, who entered into peril for love of him. But they shall not walk again ever among elves or men in the outer lands. And this is my decree concerning them. To Eärendil and to Elwing, and to their sons, shall be given leave each to choose freely to which kindred their fates shall be joined, and under which kindred they shall be judged." So, Manwë pronounces his judgment. First, he says that they can never return to Middle-earth, and they don't. Then he gives them a choice, as Nathan mentioned in his question. They could choose a mortal life, an afterlife, or they could choose an elven lifespan. And notably, Manwë gives that choice to their sons as well, Elrond and Elros. And here's the passage from the Silmarillion about the choices of Eärendil and Elwing. "Then Eärendil said to Elwing, 'Choose thou, for now I am weary of the world.' And Elwing chose to be judged among the firstborn children of Ilúvatar, because of Luthien, her grandmother. And for her sake, Eärendil chose alike, though his heart was rather with the kindred of men and the people of his father. So they both choose to be counted as elves, though it sounds like Eärendil would have preferred to be counted as a human. So now it's on Elrond and Elros to choose. And we get this quote from the appendices. "At the end of the First Age, the Valar gave to the half-elven an irrevocable choice to which kindred they would belong. Elrond chose to be of elven kind, and became a master of wisdom. To him, therefore, was granted the same grace as to those of the high elves that still lingered in Middle-earth, that when weary at last of the mortal lands, they could take ship from the Grey Havens and pass into the uttermost west. And this grace continued after the change of the world. But to the children of Elrond, a choice was also appointed, to pass with him from the circles of the world, or if they remained, to become mortal and die in Middle-earth. For Elrond, therefore, all chances of the War of the Ring were fraught with sorrow." So this quote shows that Elrond chose to be counted as an elf, but more importantly, it shows that the ability to choose has been passed on to his children, who would be Arwen, who chooses a mortal life, and his twin sons, Elrohir and Elladan, whose ultimate choices were not told. If I had to guess, I'd say they chose to be counted as elves and be reunited with their father and mother in the west. For Elrond's twin brother Elros, he chose a mortal life and became the first king of Númenor. He presumably married a human woman, although we don't know her name. Hence, his 4 children were also mortal, and they were not given a choice. And that's what we know about half-elves. The key is that they were given the ability to choose not simply because they were half-elven, but because of the heroic actions of Eärendil and Elwing. And that leaves Dior, son of Beren and Luthien. By the rules I just stated, he wouldn't have had the choice, because he was out of the picture by the time Eärendil and Elwing made their journey. After Luthien's father, King Thingol, died, Dior became the king of the elven realm of Doriath, and he was killed by the sons of Feanor in the second kinslaying. I can make a strong case either way for Dior, whether he was counted as an elf or a human. He was only 36 when he died, so we don't have an impossibly long lifespan to point to. He was king of Doriath, and the elves of the region accepted him as such, which strongly suggests he was counted amongst the elves. And he married the elf Nimloth, and that marriage was not considered one of the human-elf relationships. But on the other hand, his father, Beren, was mortal, obviously, and his mother, Luthien, traded in her immortality to bring Beren back from the dead. They then had the child Dior, which would almost certainly make Dior mortal. So I think the answer is that Dior was a king due to his lineage. But had he not been killed in the second kinslaying, I think he would have eventually died of old age and not gone to the halls of Mendos. Just my opinion. Dior is our odd half-elven anomaly. Since we've been talking about Eärendil, I read a fascinating article about life imitating art. Earlier this year, astronomers discovered the most distant star now known to science. Obviously, there are some Tolkien nerds in the astronomy community because that star is now officially named Eärendil. A reference to the fact that in Tolkien's universe, the evening star is Eärendil, carrying a Silmaril across the sky in his flying ship. Love that. Eärendil lives! Anyway, thanks so much for the question, Nathan. I hope I provided some answers. Our last question for part 1 comes from another awesome friend of the channel, Lord of the House of Stormcrows. And Stormcrow asks, who would win in a fight between Turin and Beleg versus Tuor and Ecthelion? I love this question, mainly because it requires my theory crafting cap, and because there's no wrong answer. So each team features a human and an elf. Turin and Tuor have very similar backgrounds. They're cousins who lived at roughly the same time during the First Age. Both were humans raised by elves, both were outlaws, and both defended hidden elven kingdoms. Turin was associated with Nargothrond, and Tuor with Gondolin. One big difference is that Tuor found happiness with a family, and Turin decidedly did not. Another difference would be that Turin's family received arguably the worst curse bestowed in the history of fiction from none other than Morgoth himself. Let's put those two aside for a second and look at their elven counterparts, Beleg and Ecthelion. Both are noble, heroic elves who are good in a fight. But there is a difference in their styles. For Beleg, we're given this quote from the Children of Húrin. There they came near to death, for winter came cold from the north. But not so light was Turin's doom. Even as they lay in despair, they heard a horn sounded. Beleg the Strongbow was hunting in that region, for he dwelt ever on the marches of Doriath, and he was the greatest woodsman of those days. He heard their cries and came to them, and when he'd given them food and drink, he learned their names and whence they came, and he was filled with wonder and pity. So Beleg is called the greatest woodsman of those days, the First Age. That's quite high praise. It tells us a lot about his competence. When Turin mistakenly kills him, we get this quote from the Silmarillion about his burial. Then Gwyndor roused Turin to aid him in the burial of Beleg, and he rose as one that walked in sleep. And together they laid Beleg in a shallow grave, and placed beside him Belthronding, his great bow that was made of black yew wood. So Beleg has his signature weapon, his black bow, Belthronding. He is undoubtedly the best archer in this group. As for Ecthelion, we hear a lot about his prowess during the fall of Gondolin. Here's a passage in which he and Tuor fight side by side. Those two lords, they came even unto the Balrogs. Of those demons of power, Ecthelion slew 3, for the brightness of his sword cleft the iron of them and did hurt to their fire, and they writhed. Yet of the leap of that axe Dramberleg that was swung by the hand of Tuor, they were still more afraid, for it sang like the rush of eagle's wings in the air, and took death as it fell, and 5 of them went down before it. So in that passage, Ecthelion slays 3 Balrogs with his sword, possibly Orcrist. But put a pin in the fact that Tuor also slays 5 Balrogs with his axe, Dramberleg. Then we get the act that Ecthelion is most famous for, his fateful battle with Guthmog, Lord of Balrogs, who had already killed 2 of the High Kings of the Noldor, Feanor and Fingon. Ecthelion, whose face was of the pallor of grey steel and whose shield arm hung limp at his side, strode above him as he fell, and that gnome drove at the demon, yet did not give him his death, getting rather a wound to his sword arm, that his weapon left his grasp. Then leapt Ecthelion, Lord of the Fountain, fairest of the Noldor, full at Guthmog, even as he raised his whip, And his helm that had a spike upon it he drove into that evil breast, and he twined his legs about his foeman's thighs, and the Balrog yelled and fell forward. But those two dropped into the basin of the king's fountain, which was very deep. There found that creature his bane, and Ecthelion sank, steel-laden, into the depths, and so perished the lord of the fountain after fiery battle in cool waters. So Ecthelion goes out in style, killing 3 Balrogs, then sacrificing himself to take out the lord of the Balrogs. It's one of the most impressive achievements in Tolkien's lore. And so, in the matchup of our elves, Beleg versus Ecthelion, I have to give the edge to Ecthelion, with one caveat. If Turin could position Beleg as a sniper during the fight, that he could rattle off a series of shots before engaging in melee combat, I'd give the edge to Beleg. But in a neutral setting, Ecthelion is the victorious elf. Now for our heroic cousins, Turin versus Tuor. We've already seen that Tuor slew 5 Balrogs with his axe, Dremberleg. But Turin Turambar's big claim to fame is defeating Glaurung, father of dragons. From the children of Húrin. Then Turambar drew the black sword of Beleg and stabbed upwards with all the might of his arm and of his hate, and the deadly blade, long and greedy, went into the belly, even to its hilts. Then Glaurung, feeling his death pang, gave forth a scream, whereat all the woods were shaken, and the watchers at Nen Girith were aghast. In my opinion, killing Glaurung trumps killing 5 Balrogs, but they're both impressive victories. When evaluating these two, you also have to compare their weapons. We know about the axe, Dremberleg. Turin wields the sword Gurthang, formerly known as the sword Anglichel. Did a video on Gurthang, if you're interested, from the Silmarillion. That was a sword of great worth, and it was so named because it was made of iron that fell from heaven as a blazing star. It would cleave all earth-delved iron. One other sword only in Middle-earth was like to it. That other sword is Angwarel, the sister blade to Anglichel, forged by the dark elf Eöl, which notably was likely wielded by the elf Maglor when Tuor defeated him. But Maglor is no Turin, and there is no sword better than the sentient blade Gurthang. Yes, it curses its wielder, but in the meantime, it is functionally a super weapon forged from a meteorite. I give Gurthang the edge over Dremberleg. Additionally, Turin wears the dragon helm of Dorloman, aka the Helm of Hador. Powerful defensive artifact. The Helm of Hador was given into Thingol's hands. That helm was made of grey steel adorned with gold, and on it were graven runes of victory. A power was in it that guarded any who wore it from wound or death. For the sword that hewed it was broken, and the dart that smote it sprang aside. It was wrought by Telkar, the smith of Nogrod, whose works were renowned. Funny enough, one of Thomas Ryan's Discuss questions involves the talents of Telkar, who also forged Angrist, the dagger Baron used to pry a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown, and, of course, the all-important Narsil. So, Turin wields an unstoppable sword and wears an unassailable helmet. And as for Tuor, yes, he is a legendary warrior. But he's overshadowed in Tolkien's mythology by his own son, Eärendil, who we've discussed in previous topics. Eärendil is the hero who ultimately wins the War of Wrath and closes out the First Age. So in some ways, Tuor is best known as Eärendil's pedigree, whereas Turin is an epic, tragic hero. And while this isn't canon, when Tolkien wrote about the final battle, Dagor Daggerath, his version of Ragnarok, who ends up killing Morgoth? Not Tuor, it's Turin wielding Gurthang. So in the Battle of Cousins, I give Turin the advantage. Which means, since I've given Ecthelion the edge over Beleg, we have a very close contest. But if I had to wager an Arkenstone on who would win, I'd bet on Turin and Beleg. Turin can kill himself, but no one else can. So, in any case, there you have it. I hope that answers your question, Stormcrow. And that does it for part 1 of this round of mini topics. I'll be back with part 2, which includes a detailed look at the life of Feanor's wife, Ne'er-do-Nell, next time. Bye, everybody.